You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. So the Lord Jesus says, at least to paraphrase his words, that we have a soul and a mind. What is the mind? How does it relate to the soul? How does Christianity relate to and deal with that discipline known as psychology? Hello, I'm Pastor Charmley. Welcome to Bethel Evangelical Free Church Handling on YouTube. In this video, I'm continuing a series of videos on these old works of theology of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Cunningham Lectures. This is a... get this one out. This is a series that was founded in 1861 and it continues to this day. I'm not going to continue the videos to this day. I'm going to have a cut-off point around about the end of the 1950s. Very largely because as time goes by, these lectures become more and more liberal, and my ability to handle large amounts of theological liberalism is, shall we say, limited. And I'm sure that the audience, the people who I know are watching this, you are not people who enjoy watching lots of videos of someone being critical of and probably rude about theological modernism. Well, we're here well into the 20th century now. The 1910s open with George Stephen of Edinburgh and his lecture, which is on the psychology of the Christian soul. The Cunningham Lectures for 1911. I haven't been able to find a lot out about George Stephen, so this video is going to be, I know some videos have been an awful lot about the lectures, not a lot about the lectures. In this video I'm probably going to say more about the lectures than about the lecturer, for a variety of reasons, one of which is I don't know much about George Stephen. What I'm able to find out is that he was born in Arbroath in 1845. He was educated, as so many of these men were, at Edinburgh University and went on to New College, so that when he was a student he would have listened to some of the early Cunningham Lectures, one of the early series. Now, the fact that so many of the Cunningham Lecturers themselves were New College men simply reflects the fact that New College was the premier flagship institution, education institution of the Free Church at the time. Following his course at New College, George Stephen was ordained at Logie Armand Free Church in 1877. In 1885 he was called from Logie Armand to St Bernard's Free Church, Edinburgh, and there he remained for the rest of his ministry. He married in 1893, and as I say, in 1911 he was asked to give the Cunningham Lectures. He chose as his subject the psychology of the Christian soul. Psychology as a formal academic discipline really has its roots in the latter part of the 19th century. The exploration of the human mind and how the human mind works and sometimes doesn't work. We all have minds. We're all conscious of the fact that our minds work in certain ways. And George Stephen, when he was choosing his subject, decided to look at psychology, although the title is The Psychology of the Christian Soul, and the word psychology originally comes from the psyche, the soul. In this book it has the meaning that we generally attach to it, the study of the mind. He writes in his introduction, his preface rather, when the theory of development in nature first compelled attention, the cry of many Christian men was, "You are driving God out of his universe." But as the years passed by, they perceived that the theory had brought him into the very heart of nature. The process itself was seen to be divine. So we have here a man who was embraced the idea of theistic evolution, that the evolutionary process comes from God, and that this is an idea that was very popular at the time. And whereas today there are many who say, well, if you believe this, you're a liberal. In the early 20th century, it wasn't the case. Even the Princeton men, even B.B. Warfield, the Lion of Princeton, held some form of theistic evolution. We shouldn't dismiss men as liberals simply for holding this position. Now, they may be liberals, but the fact that somebody holds a position on evolution that we believe to be unbiblical and wrong does not make them a liberal. I see too often on the internet these days people using the word liberal to mean any individual whose theological position is somewhere to the left of where I am. It gets worse when it comes to the United States, because there is this awful tendency to conflate liberal theology and political liberalism, and then to conflate political liberalism with political leftism. And modern, postmodernist leftism is not classical liberalism. It's rather something quite illiberal and extremely intolerant, because it's redefined tolerance as being agreeing with me. Well, we're all okay with people who agree with us, or most of us are. But I digress. To get back to George Stephen. To a Christian man studying today the nature of the spiritual life, it is open to ask how far this idea of process extends, because he believes that without God there is no spiritual process at all. Spiritual process is God working in the minds of men. That is the ruling conception of this book. The writer believes that the spirit of man is in some way supernatural, and that Christianity is an educative process by which that spirit may be so trained as to hate and fear sin, or when it has yielded to sin, may be delivered and purified. The educative and redemptive power he believes to be the personality of Jesus Christ, the Lord of men. To search into all this patiently and humbly is true reverence. We seek to understand God's dealings with men. Now, to say that Christianity is an educative process is partially true, but it's not merely education, because one of the realities that we need to understand is the reality of the fall, and that the fall of man hasn't just affected our environment, it's affected every human being, so that we are all born in sin, that we are indeed conceived in sin, that we live in sin, not simply in terms of the way the language is generally used to speak of people living in an immoral relationship, but sin is the environment in which we live. And so it is that Jesus says you must be born again. And that applies to everybody. It's not merely a matter of, well, if someone is brought up right, they'll never need to be converted. Now, it will look different. Conversion will look different in terms of someone who's brought up in a Christian household and someone who's not. The conversion of a Muslim to Christ is going to look very different than the conversion of someone who comes from a devout, religious Christian household. But there still is a conversion in both cases. The conversion of John Wesley, the son of a minister, or the conversion of Thomas Spurgeon, the son of Charles Spurgeon, is going to look very, very different from the conversion of a Muslim, simply because the background is different. In the Muslim case, there is so much to be unlearned. In the Christian case, so much has been learned, but what there needs to be a new creation, a personal link. So it's not merely education. But Stephen goes on to say, the story of one man's search, all imperfect as he knows it to be, is here set out in the language of students of the human mind. The writer knows of only one claim he has to be heard. Through many years it has been his duty and privilege to study not books only, but the original sources at first hand. He has been forced to bring his own theories and those of books to the final test, the lives of men and women. It is of course a very old study, but also very new. He was a pastor. He dealt with human beings. And this is something that is extremely important. The chapters of the book, there are 8 of them. The first is the religion of Christ, an educative process, which is as good as far as it goes, but doesn't really go far enough. The process of education, the second chapter, in the development of the soul. Chapter 3, the place of the subconscious in the development of the soul. Chapter 4, the enslaving of the soul through sin. Chapter 5, the liberating of the soul through conversion. Chapter 6, the soul in the mass movement of a revival. Chapter 7, the capture of the soul by God. And Chapter 8, the soul in the presence of God. Of course, he writes as a man of the early 20th century, the first decade really of the 20th century, because he will have begun writing this, and all the materials for it will come from before 1910, given that the lecture is delivered in 1911. He opens chapter 1. Some 40 years ago, Lord Morley, in his work on compromise, was led to speak of the attacks that had been made on the religious position by unbelief, and of the change in the temper of unbelievers. Now, he says, the modern attack, while fully as serious and much more radical, has a certain gravity, decorum, and worthiness of form. Well, of course, this was written long before the internet. A man 100 years after Stephen would say that, as people have, that the nature of the attack on Christianity in the last 20, 30 years has deteriorated rapidly, so that, of course, the popular internet atheist, all he's interested in is being rude about people, and sadly the all too common Christian response is just to be rude back. And I fully understand that it is the temptation to be rude back to the rude atheist. After all, sometimes you want to answer a man according to his folly, and sometimes it's right to do that. The question is, how is that to be done? But to go on, he says, no one of any sense or knowledge now thinks that the Christian religion has its origin in deliberate imposture. And I would say that's still true, even though there's a lot of stuff on the internet today that suggests just that. Deliberate imposture. Jesus didn't exist. It was all a fake created by the Romans. That's one hypothesis. It's a load of rubbish, and that's why it's accepted by absolutely no scholars of any note whatsoever. He goes on to say, and it is for this we quote him, the modern freethinker does not attack it, he explains it. And what is more, he explains it by referring its growth to the better, and not to the worst part of human nature. He traces it to man's craving for a higher morality. He finds its source in their aspirations after noble expression of that feeling for the incommensurable things, which is in truth, under so many varieties of inwoven pattern, the common universal web of religious faith. And you can see, of course, in that various points of modern critiques of Christianity, attempts to explain it away, the attempt to explain religion psychologically, that religion is after all merely a matter of the striving of the human mind. But to go on with Stephen, in other words, the modern attack on religion will be by means of the psychology of the religious soul. But 40 years bring in their revenges, and it is now more apparent than it was that the better part of human nature, men's cravings for a higher morality, their aspirations, their feeling for incommensurable things, have themselves to be explained, and that the psychology of religion is only the explaining of the way in which the deeper things of life work within the human mind. And so he embarks upon this effort to talk about this, to talk about the educative element in Christianity. But education is not enough, so he says. The question is raised at once, can the soul be developed into a personality like that of Christ by means of education? Can religion be taught? Now, personal religion, signifying that by the term the personal relationship of the human spirit to the divine, we can no more teach than we can preach it. The surrender of a man to the love of God can be accomplished only by the man himself, as the free choice and determination of his own spirit. And if he can surrender to God, he can reject him. Here again there is a failure to recognize the reality of the need in every case for the new birth. Make what we may of education, there is manifestly something deeper. John and Judas together received the same religious education, witnessed the same works done by their master, heard the same words of grace, came in hourly contact with the same transcendent personality. Nevertheless, one of them betrayed him, and the other wrote the fourth gospel. Education is not enough. The mind indeed must be enlightened, but that is not enough. Education isn't enough to make someone a Christian. Only God can make a Christian, as only God can make a human being. Now, one of the great aspects that needs to be considered of psychology, one of the things, certainly at the time, and even today, is the idea of the subconscious. What is the subconscious mind? What is the place of the subconscious in the development of the soul? Well, too often, of course, there is this idea the subconscious is almost another me, the real me, or another mind within my head. But of course, that's not possible at all. That's not true. The subconscious, rather, is me. So that Stephen can say, as I look for the quote here, he speaks of the reality of the subconscious, and he says, "We have seen that the subconscious is nothing more than me. From all this," he says, "we're entitled to conclude that the subconscious mind is our own mind, as we have ourselves built it up. The idea, the notion that the subconscious is something separate, if not different from personality, is without evidence, even from hypnotism. There is nothing in the subconscious foreign or mysterious, nothing to alarm us unduly, or to fill us with any hope, of any magical deliverance. The subconscious is neither a demon nor an angel. It is me. It is never contrary to my character." Now, of course, there have been cases of people with split personality, with personality disorders, but that is another matter. That is not that one is the conscious, the other is the subconscious, but that the person with that issue is ill, and they need help, and they need serious help. He goes on to speak of the enslaving of the soul through sin. The development of a Christian personality would be simple, but for the presence of a power which sometimes seems to be mightier and subtle than Christianity itself, that is, sin. But sin renders the life even of a Christian hard, bitter, and it may be tragic. As we learned in our childhood, it starts with the history of our race, it runs through all ages and lands, mars the peace of every soul, trips up the careless, mocks the endeavours of the strong after a reformation, cripples the noblest worker, and stains the devotion of the saint. Christian men of all ranks and degrees have confessed it. Christian literature has been fashioned by it into its tenderest and loftiest cadences, as men mourn over their defeats or rejoice over their victories. But just at this moment there is a tendency to belittle the sense of sin, both in the direction of our repentance and of our mastery over it. Those who experience it keenly are said to be morbid, neurotic, sick. All that is necessary for escape is said to be to ignore it. When a man falls, he should, without troubling about the cause of the fall, rise and press on again. He need not reflect on the nature of man himself as the abiding source and origin of the fall. For once, a scientific man is content to accept a fact without seeking the explanation. But the Christian consciousness cannot rest satisfied with that. Sin is not a fact that comes to me from without. It is not an experience that accidentally befalls some. It is their own act, their own choice in the face of an alternative choice, which they know they might have made. And the deed which they have done is an offence against one who has favoured and benefited them at every turn in life. It is not easy to see how regret, and deep regret over a wrong done to a friend, could be called morbid. The pointsman, that's the man who operates the points on a railway line, is not morbid who most bitterly regrets the blunder that has brought a dozen lives to an untimely end. Sin is called morbid only because this personal aspect of it is forgiven. So while Stephen doesn't say enough about the reality of the fall at the beginning of the book, he does deal with the reality of sin. And he deals also with the question of revival. Now, revival is not merely a psychological thing, but revival does have a strong psychological element. We live in an age where the Pentecostal movement and the charismatic movement have brought up this idea of signs and wonders. And of course Stephen lived at the beginning of the Pentecostal movement, so that he says, surely the outcropping even in our time of a desire for signs and wonders, tongues and healings and miracles, the belief in them, the subdued language when they appear, are due to materialization of spiritual religion. That is to say, instead of dwelling on the spiritual, there is the material, the outward, the visible, that is dwelt upon. Why? The true manifestation of the Spirit is love for God and man. Jonathan Edwards, when he considered the distinguishing marks of an extraordinary work of the Holy Spirit, did so in the recognition that outward things were not true marks. They were not marks of falsehood either, but that the reality of religion and the reality of revival is to be sought in the human heart. And so while this book, I could say it has its flaws, which are quite a lot, nevertheless it is a book that excites thought. And for that reason, if for no other, it is a welcome part of this collection. Consider this: you have a soul, you have a mind, and your mind is to be employed in things divine. And not every mental move, not every thought of God comes from God directly, but the Christian mind thinks on things and dwells on things and brings us at last to a deeper, richer and fuller appreciation of God and his ways. Well, thank you for watching. May God bless you and help you in the reading of the best books, and especially his book, the Bible, the best book of all.